Some of my earliest memories have been running through my mind. Been thinking a lot about my dad and my mom. You know, I was born in 1928, just a year before the big financial crunch that predates this one that we're going through now. I'm indebted to a third grade teacher at Elkhart, Kansas for settling some things about whether or not my early memories were accurate. I'm indebted because when my brother wrote some memoirs and then I wrote some and he was reading mine, he said, "That's a lie, you always are telling lies." Well, now what are you saying I'm telling a lie about? And he said, "Well, you say that you didn't remember being poor, but you remember being hungry, and you were never hungry." I think I've told you before that when we were in our 60s or 70s, I visited him down at his winter home at that time in Rockport, Texas. His sweet wife finally intervened and said, "Marvin, maybe your younger brother had different metabolism than yours." He had told me, he said, "You don't know what you're talking about, that you were born in an elevator. You just misunderstood what Mother said to you if you think that's what she said." Well, I'm indebted to Mrs. Childs, former third grade teacher of my oldest son in Elkhart, Kansas. Had an English project, I'm sure. Kids had to write to one of your parents' parents. He wrote to my mother, and we found a letter later where she said right in it that you were born in an elevator, and when you were about a month old, we moved to an elevator behind. Well, on the matter of food, Marvin finally said, you know what? I was 3 years older than you, and by the time I started to school, you were as big as I was. The wise wife, his wife, said, "You see, Marvin, he did have a different metabolism than you did, and he probably was hungry." But anyway, I remember a little bit, not much, about being out there in the Oklahoma Panhandle. I don't know if Dad was there year-round or if he went back and forth, but I remember being there at least one winter when he and my Uncle Howard, my grandmother's brother, took a Model T and went out jackrabbit hunting in the snow, in the fields. One of them driving and the other with a baseball bat, and they go along and catch a jackrabbit huddled down underneath the tumbleweed and whack it over the head. And I remember taking them in, skinning them, getting them, hanging them on the windmill to freeze. Oh yeah, we ate them. You bet we did. We ate a lot of them over the years later too, carrying a gun on the tractor and on the combine. Well, I also remember, I think I've said this somewhere else, I remember a trip back from that country for Christmas at the Riggs house there west of Enid, the grandparents' house. Significant to me for two reasons. One, the Model T broke down on a bridge, and I think as a little kid I was scared to death. The car quit running, and you look over the edge there, and there's a lot of space between here and the riverbed down there. I don't think there's any water in it. Probably was the Cimarron that's frequently dry. But I do remember that breakdown. I remember that wagon for Christmas. Then I suppose as much from talk as from reality, I remember Dad talking about he and his father taking teams of horses. Probably it was WPA work. I don't really know that, but I know he worked for the WPA, and I bet maybe Grandpa did too. But I know that they were proud of the fact they had small teams that could outwork big teams, a lot of the big teams, and that they used what they called a slip and something else to move the dirt, to build the road base, to put some of the paved roads in and around Enid into operation. I remember out there in the Panhandle on a crispy cold morning that I thought, I don't know, I must have done something terrible. Anyway, it scared me to death. My dad picked me up and threw me into the horse tank. And man, I'm flailing and trying to swim, not realizing I'm not in the water. there was ice on the horse tank, and he threw me across there just to give me a ride, I guess, and a thrill. I don't think he meant to be mean. Scared the pants off of me, though, I'll tell you right now. So it's a memory. Dads are ornery sometimes, and maybe a little too ornery. I pulled a few tricks on my kids I'm ashamed of. I expect he was ashamed of that one, and I bet if he told Mama, he caught heck. I remember some talk that during the Dust Bowl, Dust Bowl years, after we had moved back to the old home place just a quarter of a mile from the grandparents' new house, I can remember watching Dad and Marvin. Dad had gotten a hold of an old truck some way, and he had rigged up some barrels and some boards. I don't know just how he had it set up, but I remember that he and Marvin would work together, and he'd back that truck under one set of barrels, and they'd jack up whatever was on there, either the gasoline tank that he delivered gas and oil to the farmers, or the wheat and dirt bed that he could haul dirt or wheat with. Whichever one he was unloading, he'd back in, do a little operation, and pull out and leave that one sitting there. Back in under the other one, they'd lower it down and bolt it down. He had one truck, two entirely different purposes. Dad was a scrapper, and he was scratching every way he could to make a living to support his family and to feed us. And I do know that later he worked for the WPA, and I think building buildings, because I heard people tell me later, for a little guy, your dad could haul the biggest loads of cement up those ramps to build, I think it was the Oxford Hotel, some big building. He also bought calves from a dairy farmer for $1. And he'd bring them to our house, and we had a few milk cows, a few chickens, I expect courtesy of Grandpa and Grandma. By God, they were going to have their grandkids go hungry. And he would take the milk from those milk cows, bucket feed those calves, get them up to a little age to wean them, put them out on the pasture. When they get up, 350, 400 pounds, he'd butcher them, cut the meat up, and go to town and peddle it door to door to sell it. Times were really hard, and he scratched hard to feed his family. He also wasn't too proud when the WPA projects had some meat. I remember one time he brought home some canned meat that, boy, oh boy, was that ever welcome at our house. I also remember out there in the Panhandle one time, in the little house that we were living in, and the bigger house that was just, not very far away, was the house that was being used to house a lot of hands. Just Mom, Dad, and us kids were in this little house, and that house had a stove that evidently had lost its legs and had some bricks holding up all of it or part of it. Something slipped, and the stove started to fall over, and there was hot coals in it. I remember my mother screaming for Marvin to go over to the other house for help while she held that up from turning it over so that the place wouldn't catch on fire. And she got her hands burned a little, but not seriously. Hard times. But oh, how lucky I am that those hard times are dealt with by going back close to Enid and not going to California. After we were back home there in the Enid, Oklahoma area, I remember there was some sort of flood went through, and I was with my dad, and we were over some place where they were trying to catch fish that had come into this local pond area with the flood. I remember I spotted a huge carp, and they were very excited, and they got that carp. Don't know who got to eat it, but I'm telling you, when you're hungry, a carp's good eating.